Welcome to this episode of Great Cities and Institutions. Today, we are going to look at a private company that raised its own army, fought its own wars, minted its own coinage, and conquered a subcontinent containing roughly a fifth of the population of the world. It was not a country, it was a business, with shareholders, a board of directors, and an annual general meeting held in a building on Leadenhall Street in the City of London. Every week on this channel, we step inside the great cities, empires, and institutions that shape the world we still live in today, tracing not just when they rose, but why and what it actually cost to build something meant to last forever. Some of these stories are about walls and monuments still standing. Others are about entire systems of government and belief that vanished centuries ago, yet somehow still shape how we live, how we're governed, and even the words we use, without most of us ever realizing it. Here is the fact that reframes the whole subject. At its height in the early 19th century, the East India Company maintained a standing army of something in the region of 260,000 men. The British Army at the same period was roughly half that size. So, a private corporation, answerable to its shareholders, commanded an army twice the size of its own nation's armed forces and used it to govern territory containing tens of millions of people. That is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration. It is the plain arrangement, and it lasted for the better part of a century. By the end of this episode, you will know how a group of London merchants with a modest amount of capital ended up ruling India, how they were saved by the first great corporate bailout in history, why the tea thrown into Boston Harbor belonged to them, how the entire enterprise came to depend on selling opium to China, and where several words you use every day come from. I want to say at the outset that this is contested history, and reasonably so. The economic consequences in particular are the subject of genuine scholarly disagreement, and I will tell you where the disagreements lie rather than presenting one side as settled. Let's begin on the 31st of December, 1600. A group of London merchants, having raised subscriptions and lobbied at court, received a royal charter from Elizabeth I. The charter granted the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies a monopoly on English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, initially for 15 years. The founding subscribers numbered around 215, and the initial capital raised was in the region of 68 to 72,000 pounds. Their motivation was specific and commercial. The Dutch had established dominance in the spice trade and had raised the price of pepper substantially, and English merchants concluded that if they wanted spices at a reasonable price, they would have to go and get them. That is the whole of the original purpose. Not empire, pepper, and the legal form matters enormously because it was genuinely innovative. The company was a joint stock enterprise. Rather than each voyage being financed separately and the proceeds distributed on return, capital was subscribed into a permanent fund, shares were transferable, and shareholders had limited exposure. That structure, which developed over the company's first decades and was mirrored by its Dutch rival, is one of the direct ancestors of the modern corporation and of the modern stock market. Shares in the company were traded in London coffee houses long before there was an exchange building. So the institution we are discussing is not only an empire builder, it is one of the templates on which modern corporate capitalism is built. It is worth understanding how the thing actually ran, because the machinery explains a good deal of the behavior. Authority sat with a court of directors, 24 men elected annually by the shareholders, meeting in London and issuing instructions by letter. And there is the central problem of the whole enterprise. A letter from London to Calcutta took roughly 6 months under sail, and a reply 6 months more. An instruction and its answer occupied a year, by which time the situation it addressed had frequently ceased to exist. So the men on the ground exercised enormous discretion, made war and peace on their own judgment, and presented London with completed facts. The directors repeatedly forbade territorial expansion as expensive and bad for trade, and were repeatedly ignored by servants who had already done it. That is a governance failure of a familiar kind, and it is one reason the company acquired an empire its own board did not want. Mortality among Europeans in India was appalling, principally from disease, and a substantial proportion of those who sailed out never returned. That shaped behavior. A man with a short life expectancy and a legal right to trade privately has a powerful incentive to enrich himself quickly. The company also maintained its own fleet of armed merchant vessels, its own military academy, and its own college for training administrators. So it had a civil service, an officer corps, a navy, and a foreign policy, and all of it reported to 24 elected directors in a building in the City of London. Now, the first 50 years, which were largely a failure. The company's original objective was the Spice Islands, the archipelago in what is now Indonesia, where nutmeg, cloves, and mace grew. The Dutch East India Company, better capitalized and considerably more aggressive, was pursuing the same objective and was winning. The decisive moment came at Amboina in 1623, where Dutch authorities arrested, tortured, and executed a group of English traders on accusations of conspiracy. It caused outrage in England and was still cited as a grievance decades later. The practical result was that the English gave up on spices and concentrated on the place they had treated as a secondary opportunity: India. That is worth pausing on. The East India Company came to India because it lost a commercial war to the Dutch somewhere else. And when it arrived as a supplicant, which is the second thing that reframes this subject. The Mughal Empire in the early 17th century was one of the wealthiest and most powerful states on earth. Economic historians working from the estimates assembled by Angus Maddison have generally placed India's share of world economic output at around a quarter at this period, comparable to or exceeding China and vastly exceeding England. Mughal revenues dwarfed those of the English crown. Its cities were larger than London. Its textile industry was the most sophisticated in the world, and Indian cotton cloth was the manufactured good Europe wanted and could not match. So when Sir Thomas Roe arrived at the court of the Emperor Jahangir in 1615 as ambassador from King James, he was not there to dictate terms. He spent 4 years seeking permission to trade, competing with Portuguese and Dutch rivals for favor, and offering gifts the Mughal court found underwhelming. The permissions he obtained allowed the company to establish trading posts, called factories, which were warehouses with resident agents rather than fortresses. Surat came first, then Madras in 1639, then Bombay, which came into English hands as part of Catherine of Braganza's dowry, and which Charles II, finding it more trouble than it was worth, leased to the company for £10 a year. And then Calcutta in the 1690s. Those 4 became the bases of everything that followed. For a century, the arrangement was commerce conducted under Mughal authority and subject to Mughal law. The company paid duties and sought permits. In the 1680s, it attempted a small war against the Mughals, was comprehensively defeated, and obliged to apologize and pay compensation. Then the political ground shifted. Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughal emperors, died in 1707 after a long reign and a series of exhausting wars in the south. What followed was fragmentation. The succession was contested. Provincial governors became effectively independent. The Marathas expanded from the west, and in 1739, the Persian ruler Nadir Shah sacked Delhi and carried off the imperial treasury, including the Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor. The empire continued in name for another century. Its authority did not, and this is essential to understanding what happened next. The company did not conquer a strong, unified state. It inserted itself into a collapsing one, in which numerous regional powers were competing, all of them needing money, allies, and increasingly European-trained infantry. Because the other thing that had changed was military. European armies of the 18th century had developed drilled infantry firing disciplined volleys with flintlock muskets and supported by field artillery. That combination, properly trained, could hold formation against cavalry. Both the French and the English discovered in India that they could recruit local soldiers, called sepoys from the Persian word for soldier, train them in European drill, officer them with Europeans, and produce a force that outperformed the larger but less uniformly drilled armies of the regional powers. The French moved first, under Dupleix, who demonstrated during the Carnatic Wars of the 1740s and 50s that a small European-trained force could decisively influence a succession dispute between Indian rulers. The English learned the lesson and applied it more effectively, which brings us to 1757 and to Bengal. Bengal was the richest province of the former Mughal Empire, with a textile industry, extensive agriculture, and substantial revenues. The company's presence at Calcutta had grown, and relations with the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, deteriorated over fortification, trade privileges, and the sheltering of his enemies. In 1756, the Nawab took Calcutta. The incident produced the story of the Black Hole, in which captured Europeans were confined overnight in a small cell with heavy loss of life. The account came from a survivor, John Holwell, and the numbers he gave have been questioned by historians ever since, with modern assessments generally regarding his figures as substantially inflated. The episode was nonetheless used to enormous propaganda effect. Robert Clive was sent to recover the city, and did, and then, at Plassey, in June 1757, he fought the battle that is usually described as the foundation of British rule in India. It is worth describing what actually happened, because it was not much of a battle. Clive had around 3,000 men, of whom roughly 2,000 were sepoys. The Nawab had perhaps 50,000, with French artillery support. Clive had, before the engagement, reached an arrangement with Mir Jafar, the Nawab's principal military commander, together with a group of Bengali bankers and merchants, notably the Jagat Seth family, who were dissatisfied with the Nawab. Mir Jafar would hold back a large part of the army. In exchange, he would be installed as Nawab, and the company and its officers would be handsomely paid. A rainstorm during the engagement soaked the Nawab's powder, while the company's was covered. The Nawab's artillery fell silent. Clive attacked. Mir Jafar's contingent did not move. The Nawab fled and was subsequently killed. The engagement cost the company somewhere around 20 men. Plassey was not a military conquest. It was a corporate takeover executed with a small armed escort, arranged in advance with the target's own management and financed by local bankers, and the payments that followed were enormous. Clive personally received a sum generally reckoned in the region of £200,000, which made him one of the wealthiest men in Britain, along with a substantial annual income granted afterwards. Now, the moment that turned a trading company into a government, and it is a legal document rather than a battle. After a further victory at Buxar in 1764, the company was in a position to dictate terms to the Mughal emperor himself. In 1765, by the Treaty of Allahabad, the Emperor Shah Alam II granted the company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The The Diwani was the right to collect the land revenue and administer the finances of the province. Consider what that means. A joint stock company registered in London, whose shares were traded in coffee houses, acquired the legal right to tax a territory of roughly 20 million people, which is more than the population of Britain at the time. It did not acquire a country. It acquired a revenue stream, legally, by grant, from the recognized sovereign. And crucially, it did not initially take on the corresponding obligations. The company collected the revenue, while the existing administration retained nominal responsibility for governance and justice, an arrangement described as dual government, and widely regarded even at the time as producing the worst of both. The consequences arrived quickly. In 1770, Bengal suffered a catastrophic famine. The immediate cause was the failure of the monsoon and successive poor harvests. What made it worse is documented, and it is not seriously disputed. The company continued to collect land revenue during the famine, and in some districts, revenue collection was increased rather than relaxed. Company servants engaged in private grain speculation. Cultivation of grain had in places been displaced by cash crops the company wanted, including opium. Estimates of mortality vary considerably, with figures commonly cited running from 1 to 10 million, and a frequently repeated estimate suggesting around a third of the population of the affected region died. The company's own revenues from Bengal did not fall proportionately. The famine was reported in Britain, and it caused genuine public disquiet, and it was one of the factors that led to the first serious political attempt to control the company. Which brings us to the part of this story that is startlingly modern. By 1772, the East India Company was on the point of collapse. It had spent enormous sums on wars. Its territorial revenues had not delivered what its directors had promised shareholders. It had continued paying dividends it could not sustain, and the Bengal famine had wrecked the productive base it depended on. It approached the British government for a loan of £1.5 million. Its failure would have been a systemic event. Its shares were held throughout the political and commercial establishment. A substantial number of members of Parliament were shareholders, and its debts were entangled with the Bank of England. The government agreed to the loan. That is a corporate bailout, granted because the institution was too large and too interconnected to be allowed to fail in 1772, and it came with conditions in the form of the Regulating Act of 1773, which created a Governor-General of Bengal and a Supervisory Council and required the company to report to the government. It also came with a second measure, intended to help the company sell its enormous unsold surplus of tea, and that measure is the reason a great many people watching this live in a country that exists. The Tea Act of 1773 allowed the company to ship tea directly to the American colonies without paying certain duties in England, undercutting colonial merchants and smugglers while retaining the existing tax collected in America. Colonists objected on the principle of taxation without representation and, less loftily, because it threatened established local trade. In December 1773, a group of men in Boston boarded 3 ships and threw their cargo into the harbor. The cargo was East India Company tea, 342 chests of it. So the bailout of a failing corporation in London produced a piece of legislation, which produced the Boston Tea Party, which produced the Coercive Acts, which produced the American Revolution. That connection is entirely direct, and it is very rarely made. Now, the men who came home, because they changed British politics. Company servants in India were paid modest salaries and permitted to trade privately, and after Plassey, the opportunities for private enrichment became extraordinary. Presents, commissions, monopoly arrangements, and outright extortion produced fortunes at a speed unavailable anywhere in Britain. Those who returned wealthy were known as nabobs, an English corruption of the Indian title Nawab. They bought country estates and parliamentary seats, which were purchasable at the time, and they were resented both by an aristocracy that found them vulgar and by reformers who regarded their wealth as stolen. Clive himself was investigated by Parliament over his conduct and his fortune. Defending himself, he made a remark that has outlived him. Describing the moment after Plassey when he was taken into the treasury of Bengal and invited to help himself, he said that he walked through vaults piled with gold and jewels, and that standing there, he was astonished at his own moderation. He was formally exonerated. He died the following year, in 1774, by his own hand. The reforming impulse continued and produced the most extraordinary legal proceeding of the era. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General, was impeached before the House of Lords from 1788, prosecuted principally by Edmund Burke, whose speeches ran for days and constituted a sustained attack on the principle of arbitrary rule over subject peoples. The trial lasted 7 years. Hastings was acquitted, exhausted, and financially ruined by his own defense costs. Whatever one concludes about Hastings personally, and historians differ, the trial matters because it was the first sustained attempt in a European legislature to hold the agents of a corporation accountable for conduct on another continent. Now, the expansion, which was rapid and which was accomplished largely by a mechanism rather than by battles. Richard Wellesley, Governor-General from 1798, systematized what became known as the Subsidiary Alliance. The offer to an Indian ruler was this: the company would guarantee your protection against external attack and internal revolt. In exchange, you would host a company force in your territory, pay for its upkeep, cede territory or revenue to cover the cost, dismiss European advisors of other nationalities, and conduct your foreign relations only through the company. The effect was that a ruler kept his throne, his title, and his palace, and lost the substance of sovereignty. His army became unnecessary and was reduced. His finances became dependent, and a company garrison sat inside his capital. Where rulers refused, the company fought. 4 wars against Mysore, under Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan, who modernized his army and deployed rocket artillery against company forces to considerable effect. Tipu was killed at Seringapatam in 1799. A long series of wars against the Maratha Confederacy, the most powerful Indian force of the period, and 2 wars against the Sikh Empire in the Punjab, annexed in 1849. And under Dalhousie, in the 1840s and 50s, came the doctrine of lapse, under which the company declined to recognize adopted heirs, meaning that a ruler dying without a natural son would have his state annexed. Several states were taken this way, including Satara, Jhansi, and Nagpur. In 1856, Awadh was annexed on grounds of misgovernment. Now, the opium, because the company's finances came to depend on it, and this is the most consequential thing it ever did outside India. The problem was tea. Britain had developed an enormous appetite for Chinese tea. China would accept payment only in silver, and had limited interest in European manufactured goods. The result was a severe and growing trade deficit, with silver flowing steadily out of Britain into China. The solution the company found was to grow something the Chinese would buy. Opium was cultivated in Bengal and Bihar under company monopoly, processed at company facilities, and sold at auction in Calcutta to private traders. And here, the company was careful. Selling opium in China was illegal under Chinese law, and the company did not wish to jeopardize its legitimate trade at Canton, so it did not carry the opium itself. It sold to independent country traders, who shipped it to the Chinese coast and sold it to smuggling networks. The silver returned, and the tea was purchased with it. The company kept its hands clean at the point of sale while owning the entire production. The volumes grew enormously across the early 19th century, and the flow of silver reversed. Chinese authorities became increasingly alarmed, both at the addiction and at the drain of silver. In 1839, the Chinese commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed a very large quantity of opium at Canton, and wrote a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria asking how a nation could permit its subjects to sell in another country a substance it prohibited at home. The British response was war. The First Opium War from 1839 to 1842 was won decisively by British naval and military technology and concluded with the Treaty of Nanking, which opened treaty ports, imposed an indemnity, and ceded Hong Kong. A second war followed from 1856, with French participation ending with further concessions and the effective legalization of the trade. In China, this period is remembered as the beginning of the century of humiliation, and it remains a live element of Chinese national self-understanding today. So the chain runs: British demand for tea, to a silver deficit, to opium cultivated in India under corporate monopoly, to addiction and war in China, to Hong Kong. Before we reach 1857, a word about that army, because its composition is the key to everything that follows. The company maintained 3 separate armies, one for each presidency: Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. Each had its own command structure, its own recruitment, and its own traditions, and they did not always cooperate well, and the overwhelming majority of the men in them were Indian. Of that force of roughly 250,000, European soldiers numbered somewhere in the region of 40,000. The remainder were sepoys, recruited locally, trained in European drill, and commanded by European officers. So the subcontinent was conquered in large part by soldiers recruited from it. That is not a paradox, and it is important not to treat it as one. India was not a nation at this point, but a collection of states, and a soldier from Awadh serving against Mysore was not fighting his own country in any sense he would have recognized. The company offered regular pay, which many Indian rulers in a period of political chaos could not, and it offered it reliably. Recruitment was heavily concentrated. The Bengal army drew large numbers of high-caste Hindus from Awadh and Bihar, producing a force with strong shared identity and shared expectations about how it should be treated. Concessions had historically been made regarding diet, caste practice, and where men could be required to serve, because crossing the sea carried religious consequences for high-caste Hindus. Through the 1840s and 50s, those concessions were progressively eroded, and the General Service Enlistment Act of 1856 required new recruits to serve wherever ordered, including overseas. Promotion was closed off. An Indian officer, however capable, could not rise above a fixed rank and would always be junior to the newest European subaltern. So by the mid-1850s, the company had built an army in which the great majority of the soldiers had accumulating grievances, strong internal cohesion, professional training in European methods, and access to modern weapons. That is the situation into which the cartridge rumor arrived. Now, 1857. The event has several names, and the naming is itself contested. British sources traditionally called it the Indian Mutiny. Indian historiography frequently calls it the First War of Independence. Many historians now use terms such as the Great Rebellion or the Uprising of 1857. I will use rebellion, and note that the choice of word carries an argument. The immediate trigger concerned cartridges. The new Enfield rifle required a paper cartridge, whose end had to be bitten before loading, and rumors spread that the cartridges were greased with a mixture of cow and pig fat, which would be defiling to Hindu and Muslim soldiers respectively. The company denied it, investigated, and eventually changed the drill. The damage was done, in part because the rumor was plausible to men who already believed a great deal else about British intentions, because the underlying causes were substantial. Annexations under the doctrine of lapse had dispossessed rulers and unsettled the aristocracy and everyone dependent on them. The annexation of Awadh in 1856 was particularly significant because a large proportion of the Bengal Army's sepoys were recruited there and their families were directly affected. Land revenue settlements had disrupted traditional landholding. Missionary activity and legislation touching on social and religious practice generated a widespread belief that conversion was the ultimate objective. Conditions of service in the army had deteriorated, including changes requiring service overseas, which for high-caste Hindu soldiers carried religious consequences. And Indian officers had been progressively excluded from senior positions. The rebellion began at Meerut in May 1857 and spread rapidly across northern and central India. Delhi was taken, and the aged Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar was proclaimed as its symbolic head. It was extremely violent on both sides. At Cawnpur, a besieged British garrison surrendered on terms and was attacked at the river, and subsequently around 200 women and children held captive were killed and their bodies placed in a well. British reprisals were systematic and severe. Prisoners were executed in large numbers. Villages were destroyed, and the practice of executing rebels by tying them to the mouths of cannon was employed deliberately for its terror and for the religious horror of the destruction of the body. Reprisals extended widely to populations not involved in the fighting, and civilian deaths on the Indian side vastly exceeded British losses. The rebellion was suppressed by 1858. Bahadur Shah Zafar was tried, exiled to Burma, and died there, ending the Mughal dynasty after 3 centuries. And the company did not survive it. The Government of India Act of 1858 transferred all its territories, its assets, and its army to the Crown. A Secretary of State for India was created, sitting in cabinet. The Governor-General became the Viceroy. The company itself continued as a shell for some years, managing the tea trade and administering pensions, until it was formally dissolved by an act that took effect on the 1st of January, 1874. Its headquarters, East India House on Leadenhall Street, had already been demolished. Now, the consequences, and this is where I want to be careful, because the economics are genuinely contested. There is a broad and long-standing argument, associated originally with Indian nationalist economists, including Dadabhai Naoroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt in the 19th century, that company and subsequently Crown rule produced a systematic drain of wealth from India to Britain, and that Indian manufacturing, particularly the cotton textile industry, was deliberately destroyed to serve British industrial interests. The evidence commonly advanced includes the shift in India's share of world economic output, which on Madison's estimates fell from roughly a quarter in the early 18th century to a small single-digit figure by independence. The collapse of Bengal's textile export industry, tariff policies favoring British-manufactured cloth, and the transfer of revenue to Britain. There is a counter-argument from other economic historians that the picture is more complicated, that the Mughal decline preceded the company, that industrialization in Britain would have displaced Indian handloom textiles through mechanization, regardless of policy, that some infrastructure and institutional development occurred, and that Madison's figures are estimates with wide margins. My reading is that the drain and deindustrialization arguments have substantial support, and that the more extreme quantified claims on both sides should be treated with caution. What is not seriously disputed is the following. India entered this period as one of the largest economies and manufacturing centers in the world, and left it as one of the poorest countries on earth. Famines occurred repeatedly under both company and crown administration, with mortality in the millions, and decisions about Indian revenue, tariffs, and agriculture were taken in the interests of a foreign shareholder base and subsequently a foreign government. Now the words, since this channel has a habit, and this one is unusually rich. The English language absorbed a very large number of words through this contact, and the most fitting is loot. It comes from the Hindi and Urdu lut, meaning plunder or stolen goods, and it entered English in the late 18th century through soldiers and company servants in India. The word for taking things that are not yours was itself taken. Alongside it, bungalow, from a Hindi word meaning of Bengal, pajamas, from a Persian and Urdu term for loose trousers, shampoo, from a word meaning to press or massage, veranda, chintz, calico, and dungaree, all fabric names and all reminders that the trade began with cloth. Juggernaut, from the temple carts at Puri, and thug, from a word for a member of a particular criminal fraternity, which brings us to the argument I want to leave you with. It would be comfortable to treat the East India Company as an aberration, a strange colonial curiosity, dissolved in 1874, with no relevance to anything now. I do not think that is right, and the reason is the structure rather than the empire. Consider what the company actually was. It was a private company pursuing returns for shareholders. It acquired governmental powers, not by conquest in the first instance, but by legal grant, and then extended them. It maintained armed force on a scale exceeding that of its own home state. It lobbied the legislature effectively, and a substantial number of legislators were its shareholders, which is a conflict of interest so complete that it barely registered as one at the time. When it failed, it was rescued by the state, because its collapse would have damaged the state, and the terms of the rescue were negotiated between people who were frequently on both sides of the negotiation, and its decisions, taken in a boardroom in London on the basis of dividends, determined the tax rates, the crops, the trade policy, and the food supply of tens of millions of people who had no representation in that room whatsoever. The company was eventually brought under control and then abolished by a state that eventually decided it could not permit a corporation to govern a subcontinent. But it took 258 years, and it took a rebellion that killed an enormous number of people. And even then, what replaced it was direct imperial rule rather than any restoration of Indian sovereignty, which arrived only in 1947. So the lesson is not that a business once did something outrageous a long time ago. It is that the boundary between a corporation and a government is not fixed by nature. It is a political decision, taken and retaken, and there is nothing in the structure of a company that prevents it acquiring the powers of a state if it becomes large enough, useful enough, and well enough connected to those making the rules. The East India Company did not seize an empire in a fit of ambition. It acquired one incrementally, legally, and largely by agreement, while its shareholders read the dividend reports in London coffee houses. It began because pepper was expensive. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the great cities, empires, and institutions that built the world we live in. Leave a comment below telling us which institution, city, or castle you would like us to explore next.